Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is the Great Big History Podcast. We continue our History 102 with the Enlightenment and Revolution. So you say you want a revolution. Well, you know. So we start with talking about the Enlightenment. What was it? What was it trying to do? And what it was trying to do was to use science to understand human nature. So science was trying to understand nature. But where do people fit in? And how do people work? And especially, what are people like outside of civilization's rules? See, civilization, from its very beginning, has all kinds of rules. You have to pick up after your dog. You have to go to work. What hours you have to go to work. What days you have off. When the stores open, when the stores close. You have to pay your taxes on what day. There's all these rules. And then religion has all its rules. And so what are people really like if there were no rules? Are they good? Are they bad? Like, what are people like without all these constraints on them? And that's what the Enlightenment was trying to do, to understand the nature of people. And so we come to Hobbes and Locke, two very influential thinkers who have two completely different versions of people, and they come out of two completely different experiences. Hobbes, who's the older of the two, comes out of the trauma of the English Civil Wars. The English Civil Wars are a series of wars where people on the British islands fought each other. The Irish, the Scots, the English, the Welsh, they all fought each other. Some 2 to 3% of the population died during the English Civil Wars, where the king attacked Parliament and Parliament attacked the king. And so Hobbes, coming out of that, thought people were barbaric, terrible, and violent. That in the absence of government, people are reduced to violence. So what is the point of government? The point of government is to stop people from killing each other all the time. That the state of nature was violence. That people were cruel and that life was short. And so government had to step in and stop that. And you've seen this in your lifetimes. Iraq from 2004 to 2007 was in a Hobbesian state where everybody was at war with everybody else. Afghanistan in the 1990s. Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Where it was a constant state of everybody, not just states and countries and organizations, but of individuals, of neighbor versus neighbor, fathers against sons, brothers against brothers, that everybody was murdering everybody else. So for Hobbes, people are violent, and they need government to allow them to live together. Locke, on the other hand, participated in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. He overthrew a king in a bloodless coup, in a coup where an entire army from the Netherlands landed in England, and the king just left. There weren't great battles. There wasn't massive bloodshed. Cities weren't destroyed. So it makes sense that Locke comes out of that experience saying, people can change their government. People are awesome. People have a right to determine the government that they live under because people are awesome. But he has a but. And it's an important but. People are awesome, yes. But they have to live together. And in order to live together, they have to give up some rights. So that everybody can get along with each other. Think of the four-way stop sign. Everybody stops. Now, I'm awesome. I am an awesome driver, and I'm an awesome person, and I have an awesome life. So, I have places to be. Why should I stop? Why should I stop for the old lady to my right in her 1987 Dodge who's going 8 miles an hour. Like, I've got places to be. Or the person to my left. Who's on their cell phone. They don't even want to be in their car. They got the kids watching DVDs in the back. They're on their cell phone because the only time they make a phone call is when they're driving. They're not concentrating on their car. They don't even want to be in the car. So why do I have to wait for that person to figure out that they should go? Like, why don't I just blow through the stop sign and do what I want to do? I'm important. I am awesome. Well, for Locke, the idea is that you all stop. You all stop because you are all awesome. All of your lives are important. All of you have places to be and good reasons to be there. So you give up your right to go first. You give up your right to blow through the stop sign so that everybody else does as well. So that you don't get into a car accident as you blow through the stop sign, but someone else blows through the stop sign because they think they're awesome too. You give up certain rights in order to live with other people. How did Rousseau feel about people? Well, Rousseau is a hippie. Of our Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau is the hippie. He thinks civilization sucks. That people were born free and everywhere live in chains. That's his quote. And it's a great quote. People are awesome. They're so awesome. They always choose the right thing. They know what's right. Common sense is correct. And the problem is that civilization stops them from being awesome. Civilization limits their freedom by giving them rules, by making them do things like who to love, who to marry, which god to worship, what days to work, what days to take off. And all of these rules are imposed by a power enforced by shame or violence or control or money. Forces the individual cannot hope to compete against. I mean, look at your Old Testament. Look at the first 5 books. There's 600 laws in those first 5 books. Not just the top 10. There's entire books that are just rules. And who's enforcing those rules? God. God is enforcing those rules. And the priests, and the king, and your mom, and your grandmother, right? There's rules. You can't be free. How many times did you have a fight with your parent or your grandparent over wearing makeup or what clothes to wear? Oh, you're going to go out in wearing that, right? It doesn't have to be a thou shalt not. It just has to be no child of mine would act like that. That's control. That's rules. That's what Rousseau is fighting against. So his argument is that we need a social contract among people. We need a general consensus of right versus wrong called the general will. We all agree that murder is wrong, right? It's kind of like the definition of obscenity and pornography that the U.S. Supreme Court came up with in the 50s and the 60s. It was the definition should depend on the people of the area. So what's pornography and obscenity in New York or Kansas may not be in New York, or the opposite. And the idea is, why should there be one standard? The people in Kansas don't live with the people of New York, and the people of New York City don't live with the people of Kansas. They should have their own standards. That's the general will. It's a very democratic, but also very local concept of society. That people together can make the rules for their own society. Think the hippies and the communes. Think John Lennon's Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. There's no hell below us, and above us is only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. There's nothing to kill or die for. There's no religion, too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Right? That's Rousseau. Why? Because in the Imagine song, all the things he's talking about are all controls. All things you have to fear or shame or be controlled by. There's also the Amish. We live an hour away from the Amish in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. They created their own little society. They have their own little civilization that lives right in the middle of America. And yet it is their own place. They have their own language. They have their own rules. They have their own government. Like, they live in connection with the American culture, but they are also separate from it as well. So they decided these are the rules we're going to live by. And except for certain things, like, say, taxes, the American culture doesn't impose. And so the Amish can remain separate. That's not true of every people in every place. How do absolutist kings feel about the Enlightenment? Well, absolutist kings obviously don't like the Enlightenment. Well, I can't say that. See, the Enlightenment wants to change absolutism. Absolutist kings have all the power. The idea was, God made me king. I have a divine right to be king. I get to make the rules. God loves me. I don't have to answer to anybody except God. Well, mostly. Like, they say that, but there's also occasionally you need a parliament, or you need the army, or occasionally the king has to rely on the church. They talk big with their divine right, but every once in a while still need to ask people permission to, like, raise taxes or join the army or, forgive their sins, things like that. But the idea of the absolutist king was, it was my country, my rules. It's my God, my law, my language, my everything. So the French king had a Catholic God, the French law, they spoke French, and everything in France was his. The king was French, and the French listened to the king. Enlightenment ideas were almost universally trying to reform the system, was trying to take power away from the kings. But, and this is why I said, kings hate it, and they do. But, and there's a but, ... Flexible kings could use it too. Flexible kings could use Enlightenment ideas to stay in power, to justify their own power. That the divine right of kings is this non-Enlightenment idea, right? It's a medieval one. It's a Roman one, right? The God put me in charge. It's a conservative idea. But flexible kings or queens could use the Enlightenment to justify, don't you want me to be king? Don't you want me to be queen? Hobbes, right? You want me to be king because if I'm not here, it's chaos. It's Louis XIV or Louis XV that is apocryphal to have said, after me, the flood, the deluge. And the idea is that the country, France, is in such a mess that after me will come the revolution. It's apocryphal. It's a great quote. But the idea was, if you were smart, you could use Hobbes. You could use Locke. You could even use Rousseau or Montesquieu or any of the other guys, the English and the French and the German Enlightenment philosophers, you could use them to your advantage. And so what we get is kind of a political liberalism versus political conservatism. So we have to talk about that because that's going to be a big deal in the revolution part of this course, the revolution part of this lecture. And it's going to be a big deal for the rest of this course of liberalism versus conservatism. So what do we mean by that? And what we don't mean is what people talk about today. We don't mean the conservative, American conservative, I'm a conservative, I believe what Fox News tells me, or I'm a liberal and I believe in all of these hippie things and blah, blah, blah. No. You have to get away from that because we're using traditional definitions. Political liberalism looked at the world and said, things are messed up. We should change. And we should change as soon as possible. Do we have to change everything? No. Changing everything is revolution. That's as liberal as you get, right? A revolution overthrows the entire system. So we're not talking about revolution. Revolution is, I want to get rid of the church. I want to get rid of the government. I want to get rid of the society and the rules of society. I want to get rid of all of these things. Right? I want to start new. That's revolution. That's as far left as you go. We're not that far liberal. We're talking about things need to change. You look around, things aren't working, and things need to change. This is why educators, teachers, professors, a lot of us are just liberal. And the reason why is it's our job to critique society, is to find problems in society. If everything was great, there's not much need for us because then you don't have to analyze everything. So it's our job to be like, this could be better and that could be better. Like, you know? So, but the idea of the liberalism is we need to fix things quickly. Now, in my lifetime. Political conservatism, on the other hand, conservatism, as we're going to talk about it, is things are fine. Things are good. Are they perfect? No. Of course not. Only God is perfect. But are they good enough the way they are and the way they have been? Yes. So if we need to change, if we need to fix things, we should do things as little and as slowly as possible. That's the idea. So where, I'll give you the example, the political example from 2010. Bernie Sanders and other people of the left, the very liberals, made the argument what we need is universal health care. Universal government health care like the Europeans have. Get rid of our health care system, overthrow it, replace it with a government-led, government-paid-for system like the French have, like the Swedes have, like the Swiss have, right? Pick one of those European systems where everybody's covered and it doesn't cost you bankruptcy. It doesn't, the hospital doesn't just suck all the money out of your bank account because you happen to get cancer, right? On the conservative side, you had, things are fine. I have health care. I get it through my job. It's good enough. I have to pay a copay, but that's not too much money. And so, dude, I don't want Europeans' health care. It scares me. I don't really understand it. The Europeans aren't that great of a people. We're America, USA #1, and so my country rocks, and so my healthcare system rocks. And it's working for me. Why would I want to change it? If you change it, it could get worse. It's hard enough to get in to see my doctor. It's hard enough. I have to make an appointment 3 months ahead. So don't make it worse. And then in comes President Obama with his kind of liberal idea. How about we keep the system for most people the way it is? employer-based. But here's the problem. There's 30 or 40 million people who have no health care. How about we figure out a way of giving most of them health care? And if we can, we'll even get them to pay for it. So it's not completely free, but it's subsidized. Because the number one problem for those people who don't have health care is the cost. And so we'll give more people health care, but in a way that looks like the system we've got, which is very conservative. And that's why nobody liked what became known as Obamacare. Nobody was happy with it. The left wasn't happy with it because it didn't satisfy the universal coverage of the European state. And the conservatives hated it because it was a massive change giving health care to 40 million people. And the argument was, if you give 40 million more people health care, that means my health care has to be worse. There'll be less health care for me. There's only 100% of health care, and if you give more people it, I get less of that. It turns out that once people got Obamacare, they liked it, but that's still a problem. It was a problem going into like 2017, where the conservatives tried to get rid of Obamacare, and it came down to 3 votes in the Senate to keep it, because the idea of throwing 40 million people off of healthcare was kind of too scary for even some conservatives. But that's kind of what we're talking about, where the revolutionaries want one thing, the conservatives want something else, and the liberalism is we can change. It doesn't need to be fixes. Now, as we go along, we're going to get revanchist, R-E-V-A-N-C-H-E, revanche, which means to return. And that's as conservative as you get. Conservatives, by definition, don't like change, but are willing to change because they know nothing's perfect, right? Only God is perfect. Humans, by definition, are not perfect. So no society is perfect. So things do change, right? Old people die. Young people grow up. Things change. New things happen. Revanchists say it was better in the past, and we got to get rid of all of the things that changed and go back. We have to return to 1955. Everything was great up until 1964. And then it's just been junk since. If we could only go back to this period of time when everything was great, it will be great again. Make America great again. That's not conservative. That's revanchist, that statement. That's why it goes back to the fascists of the 30s. It's then picked up again in the 80s because it's a good slogan, and it's picked up again by President Trump in 2016, 2015, 2016. Make America great again. It was great, and now it sucks. Don't you want to make it great again? If you want to make it great again, don't do what the liberals want, which is to change things. Go back to the way things were. That's revanchist. That's going to make a big deal when we get to revolution. So how do Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau feel about revolutions? Well, you can guess, right? Hobbes hates revolutions. It only leads to violence and disaster. It's worse than the original government. Anarchy is worse. Life is better under a tyrannical government than under anarchy. And I've had students, you say, oh, that's not true. I have had students who are Syrian. I've had students who are Iraqi refugees, and they said the same thing. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Assad is a bad government. Assad is a murderous, torturous, dictator. But my life was better than what happened, where they ended up as refugees, members of their family dead, their homes destroyed, their daughters working as prostitutes to make some money in a refugee camp. Like, the stories I heard from the few, and I didn't have many, but I had enough, Iraqi and Syrian refugees, Mali refugees, young men from Mali, young women from Mali who were escaping the Islamic terrorist groups and ended up in the United States, said the same thing. It was better before. It was not great, but at least it was predictable, it was safe. And that's Hobbes. Now, Locke, well, supports revolution. We know this because the Declaration of Independence of 1776 of the United States is literally Locke. It is Locke. I mean, it is plagiarism Locke. I mean, Thomas Jefferson plagiarizes Locke. I would have given Thomas Jefferson a 0 in my class for plagiarism. That's how much it's Locke. So Locke supports it, but only after you try everything else. He's not a revolutionary, Locke. I mean, he is because he participated in a revolution. But remember, he doesn't want to burn down the entire government. He just wants to get rid of the bad king, James II. When William and Mary come in, he's perfectly happy with the new king and the new queen. They sign some rules that give more power to Parliament, and boom, we're done. You don't have to change everything. So you support it only after you tried everything else. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, everyone gets that first paragraph. It's beautiful. But the rest of the document is a list of things that the revolutionaries thought were bad and the ways they had tried to solve them. They're like, we tried to fix this problem. The King of England won't. And so we have no choice but to revolt. Tyrannical government should be overthrown only after it proves it's completely unwilling to reform. Since government is created by the people and not by God, it's there to help people. If government helps itself, well, that can happen. And remember, Hobbes is talking about chaos. Locke doesn't want that kind of chaos. He thinks it's less likely than what Hobbes thinks, but at the same time, Locke doesn't want that to happen. And so the idea is you got to give government chances to reform. And if it proves unwilling to reform, well, then you might have to overthrow it. Rousseau? Che, viva la revolution. Government is the problem. Trust the people to live their own lives. Government is as local and as democratic as possible. We're going to see this in the French Revolution. We're going to see this in the Russian Revolution. This kind of Rousseauian idea that you can have radical democracy. Local people deciding for themselves. And it doesn't turn out so well in either case. But we'll get there. So was the American Revolution conservative? And the answer is, heck yeah, it was. Yes, it was a conservative revolution. So wait, I just talked about how revolutions are left, and it is because it's change, right? But here's the thing about the American Revolution that makes it a weird revolution. The rights that the revolutionaries are fighting for are traditional English rights of representation of ownership of property. In New England, it was the idea of why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea? Why should Britain have a monopoly over the say of rules and taxation? Don't we have a right to representation? It is not about taxes. The American Revolution, let me just tell you this. I know I have to put an asterisk. It's not about taxation. It's just not. You want to know how I know it's not? Because the Americans, revolutionaries, during the American Revolution and afterwards, paid much higher taxes than the English citizens they were revolting against. Had they cared about taxes being too high, they would have stayed British. The problem wasn't the taxes. The problem was the representation. That they didn't feel they had a say in those taxes. Well, that's New England and the Mid-Atlantic, New York and Pennsylvania. But in the South, no one cared about the taxes. They cared, and they didn't care even about the representation. They cared about the slaves. They cared about the enslaved people as property, that when the American Revolution begins and British generals need more soldiers, people in the army to help them conquer Boston, to help them occupy New York, to help them beat Washington and his rebels, they say, hey, come and join us, and you won't be slaves anymore. And the South went, what? That they're ours. They're our workers. They're our property. I paid money for them. You can't take them away. And so the South was about property, the ownership of property. These are conservative ideas, that the government can't take your property without compensation, and that you should have representation, a say in what the government does, especially about taxation. These are conservative ideas. They were traditional English rights that go back to at least the Magna Carta. The American Revolution is also conservative because the people who were in charge before in North America are in charge afterwards. 41 of the 56 Declaration of Independence signatories owned slaves. Washington owned 50,000 acres. Jefferson had 600 enslaved persons. Benjamin Franklin and John Hancock were at times the richest American in all the Americas. Benjamin Franklin in 1785, John Hancock, 1790. Rensselaer, the guy who will marry Peggy, Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law, owned 1 million acres in New York State. 1 million. Do you even know how insane that number is? It was worth somewhere around $100 billion. Like, that's how wealthy these guys were. So it makes sense that when the king said, I've got new rules, these guys said, for who? Not for us. They were in charge. And they weren't going to be bossed around by a young George III who, having defeated the French, had decided it was now time to run America. No. They were going to be in charge. And thus the American Revolution is a conservative revolution led by conservatives. The innovative part, the liberal part, is that the poor folk got a bigger say in the government, but not a massive say. This is not a democracy. We are not a democracy when we start. There is no popular election of the president. The House of Representatives was the minor branch, elected every 2 years. You didn't elect senators. You didn't elect, say, taxation, right? But what poor white folk got was the right to colonize. And through the Second Amendment, to colonize with guns the entire West. From Pittsburgh on west, you took your gun, you took your woman, you took your horse and your ox, and you could wage war against the Native Americans. And then carve out your own little territory, which then, if enough people did, could itself become a state. And slowly but surely, that's what happened. Like Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin do not go to Ohio. None of them end up in Illinois. Rensselaer does not own land he does not go to Texas. Texas existed. It was part of Mexico, but it was there. He doesn't go there and go west. It's poor folk that go west. Carve out their farms, fight with the Native Americans, die from diseases, die from war, kill Native Americans with war or diseases, and carve out with blood and sweat the West. And the idea was, leave us the F alone. I'm going west. This is an idea that is as old as civilization. From Sumeria, that started in the south of Mesopotamia, the cities moved north. People left the cities where there were rules and taxes and regulations, and they went to the frontier. They went up the rivers, further and further and further away from government. And then, if enough of them did that in an area, they formed a new city for protection, for economics, for trade. And then their children or their children's children did the same. They left. They went up the rivers. So what is happening in America was happening in the start of civilization. Okay, what about the French Revolution? Was it conservative? France. Well, if you know anything about Les Mis, if you've seen Les Mis, you know the answer is no. Even though Les Mis is not the French Revolution, it's the Revolution of 1830. But that's a whole different thing because that's the revolutionary spirit because France is red, the color of angry men, right? Was the French Revolution conservative? Heck no. It wanted to overthrow the entire system of wealth in France, murder the king, murder the royal family. Now, when it starts, it's not that way. When the French Revolution begins, it's not a revolution. It's a disagreement about who has power. The king had all the power, and the middle classes are like, we're starving. The king has no money. We have no food because there's a drought and a terrible famine. How about you give us some of the power? And the king's like, heck no. And the people said, well, if you don't give us power, we're going to take it. And the king said, you can try, and I'm going to take my army and shoot you. And the army's like, you mean to shoot all of our family members? Because we're poor guys who are in your employ. And he's like, you mean you're not going to shoot them? And they said, no, but we might shoot you. And so they murder the king. They chop off his head and the heads of Marie Antoinette and much of the royal family and much of the nobility. If you were a rich dude, you either got your land confiscated and your head cut off or you gave it away to the people. The French Revolution obliterated, liquidated the wealth of 1,000 years of French nobility. It eliminated ranks. No longer did you have sirs and madams and dames and knights, and everyone was a citizen. They're all equal. And the French Revolution gave rights to people, democratic government for men, female independence from men, and an end to slavery without compensation, which is a big deal in the colonies in the Caribbean, like, say, Haiti, which is 90% African people were enslaved. Like, imagine when that rule shows up, how people felt, how the French white people, rich plantation owners felt when that rule showed up. The point of all this is that this created nationalism and invents this concept of there being a France. Now, we had countries, but the countries were tied to the king, and the French just murdered their king. So, like, there was a Sweden, and Sweden was this land that was run by the Swedish royal family, the Swedish king. And so it had the absolutist ideals. It was the Swedish language. It was Lutheran. It was the God of the Swedish king. It was all these things. What the French Revolution did was get rid of all that and say, France is not the domain of a king. France is the domain of its people. The French Revolution makes French citizens with French rights. That's Les Mis. That's Act 2 of Les Mis. So what about Napoleon's Wars? All right, so you kill a king, right? We've done this before, right? You read Shakespeare, half the kings are murdered. So this is not a big deal. How does Napoleon come along, and how does Napoleon Wars become the biggest wars since 1648? And, well, look at what happened to Napoleon. Look at the art. He goes from being a revolutionary, sexy young revolutionary, to a general, to an emperor? Wait a minute. We just murdered a king and we're going to get an emperor? That doesn't seem very French. How did that happen? Well, what happened is too much revolution. Too much revolution equaled a conservative backlash, which equaled the terror, right? There comes the point where the church and the nobility, and at this point the king was still alive, go, wait a minute, wait. We're cool with changes, but do we have to change everything? And the revolution, the leaders of the revolution, Robespierre, Marat, were like, yes, We have to change everything. And those who are against us are against France. They're traitors to the people of France. They're traitors to the French nation. And we have to find these guys and we have to murder them. And that is the terror. They literally called it the terror. Like we call it terrorism, but Robespierre called it the terror. You had to get rid of everybody who didn't believe in the revolution to the same extent as the revolutionaries in charge. Now, the problem with that is, how do you prove someone believes in an idea as much as you do? And what about if someone comes along with an even more radical idea of the revolution? So you say, we're going to confiscate the noble lands and we're going to murder all the nobles. And people say, yeah, that's great. Good. We have consensus. And I say, I'm liberal. Every peasant should get 100 acres. You're going to get people who go, wait a minute, you can't farm 100 acres if you don't have machines and like 3 horses and an ox, and most people don't have that. So maybe we should give them 20 acres, which is what they could actually farm. And then I say, you are against the revolution. Take him away. Arrest him. He is a counter-revolutionary, right? And he gets executed for saying 20 acres would be good enough. I want 100 acres, right? But guess what can happen? Somebody comes along and says, you know what the people really should have is 200 acres. And what do the peasants say? The peasants go, oh, you're going to double my wealth? Great. I can't farm it, but I want to own it. So 200 acres for me. Woo! And I go, but they can't farm that. And I already said 100 acres. Well, this new guy says, you are a counter-revolutionary. Off with his head. And now I went from being the liberal to the conservative, and now I'm being executed. And that's what happened in the revolution. The revolution began to eat itself. And this leads us to Napoleon. Napoleon is an army officer who becomes a general, who looks at this chaos of the revolution eating itself and says, to save the revolution, it has to spread everywhere. But it also has to stop. We have to stop the revolution at home and spread it everywhere. In Europe, that means free all the peasants. Yay! The peasants in Germany are like, woo! This is Beethoven. Beethoven is sitting there in Germany, and he's writing the Emperor Symphony No. 3, and he's like, this guy is going to solve the problems. Napoleon is bringing the revolution. He is freeing the people from these evil rich guys who have been oppressing us. It's great. The problem is that to do this, France must conquer Europe with an army, and to pay that army, it has to force foreign people to pay taxes. Boo! People don't want that. They do not want to overthrow their German duke to replace it with Napoleon, a French king, a French emperor. That's crazy. And you see Beethoven literally scratches out. You can see the piece of paper. He's so mad. And Napoleon scratches out the Emperor's Symphony and calls it the Eroica. So by trying to conquer Europe to free the peasants, but also to make other countries pay for the French Revolution, all Europe is at war. And it's the largest wars since the 30 Years' War. All of Europe is at war. To defeat liberalism, conservatism realized it had to change. So you get things like more voting rights in England, right? Less oppressive debt laws for peasants. And to defeat Europe, Napoleon had to limit or roll back the French Revolution. He couldn't have the terror. He couldn't have chaos. He needed men in the army, and he needed citizens to be making stuff for the army. So the revolution had to stop at home in order to spread it abroad. And to stop it from spreading abroad, conservative societies had to add a little bit of liberalism. So Napoleon will lose. And I have a map of all the different battles that are fought all over Europe. War is everywhere. It's on the seas. It's all over Europe, from Portugal all the way to Moscow. Napoleon loses, but Europe is never the same. Why? Because conservatism is now in a constant fight with liberalism. Because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. People now know you can kill the king and kill the nobility. You can take their money and you can have a better country, a more egalitarian country, a more equal country, a more democratic country. You can't go back. In fact, the winning powers put a king back in charge of France. They put Louis the 17th or Louis the 18th in charge of France and said, "Ha ha, you have a king now." And he lasted 10 years and got overthrown. The French were not going to go back to a Louis. It wasn't going to happen. So you couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. What about Haitis Revolution? In this chaos comes Haitis Revolution. And Haitis Revolution has a question. Does the Enlightenment and the French Revolution apply to black people? It obviously applies to French people. And there's a definition kind of for that. It's Catholic. It's people who live in France. So most of them are white. They're European. They're Catholic. They speak French. They live in France. But does the Enlightenment and the French Revolution apply to black people? And the answer by 1804 is yes, it does, kind of. Whenever we talk about rights and black people for the rest of this course, it's going to be yes, kind of. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. If you ever get that step forward. So, Haitis Revolution is several steps forward. And then, like Sisyphus, a tumbling back down the mountain. So, Haitis enslaved peoples revolt. And they overthrow the ownership class. Now, in Haiti, the enslaved peoples outnumbered the ownership class by 9-1. Right? It was 90% of the population were enslaved people of African descent. Haiti is so wealthy that the French wanted to get it back. The Spanish wanted to conquer it. They're right next door, right, in the Dominican Republic, San Domingo. And the English even go, "Oh, we could get this too. We'll get it from Jamaica. We'll get it with Jamaica. There'll be sister sugar colonies." And the Haitian, newly liberated people, freemen of African descent, defeat them all. A combination of disease, especially yellow fever, but military tactics and spirit de corps, defeat of invasion by the French, an invasion by the Spanish, and an invasion by the English. They create, through revolution and war, the first black republic, because remember, there are black kingdoms in Africa, but this is the first modern black European-type republic, and the second independent state in the New World. The United States comes first. And they have an economy that is based on sugar and cash crops. Haiti was a rich place. It should be rich, independent, and it is a state capable of a cultural revolution. Why? They have the French language, right? So they can communicate with Europeans, but they have all that African blackness, culture of West Africa, of all the different peoples. So there's no reason why they should be stuck with a European culture. They could create something new, this kind of cultural revolution. So it's a rich place. It's independent. It could build schools. It could build universities. It could be a Wakanda in the New World. It has all the necessary ingredients, except acceptance by other countries. White countries, European descended countries, Jefferson in the United States, Napoleon in France, said, "You," pointing at Haiti, "were not a real country, and we will not accept you into our club." And so these countries said, "Yes, you have sugar. Yes, you have cash crops. We won't buy any of it. We are going to have a trade embargo on you, and we are going to force you into poverty. We might not be able to conquer you, but we can impoverish you." And to make any money, because this is a small island or half an island in the middle of the Caribbean, to get any trade, the Haitian liberated freemen had to agree to pay French slave owners reparations. They had to agree to pay the owners reparations for having freed themselves from slavery. How effed up is that? And it was such a huge amount, it plunged Haiti into national poverty. Now remember, at the same time, Jefferson is borrowing money, is literally printing it, buying bonds to buy Louisiana from the French, from Napoleon. He's going to double the size of the United States. How? Why? Because he just made up money that the French were willing to take. And in exchange for the money that he just made up, the French said, we'll give you this land. They had a negotiation. They had an agreement. They had a trade. And then they honored that trade. The exact thing they weren't doing with Haiti. Because the idea was, if Haiti could be successful, then it meant all of those sugar colonies in the Caribbean could be successful, could be independent. Then the whole idea of racism would be wrong. And what about the African descendants in the United States from Delaware on south? In fact, in all 13 colonies, 13 new states. Because slavery was not illegal yet in many, if any, of those states by 1804. 1804, the slave trade wasn't even illegal yet. So for white countries, the idea that a black country, a black republic, could be equal to them diplomatically, culturally, economically, was too much. So what are the results of the Age of Revolution? Well, the results are chaos. Millions dead. Europe wrecked. But the ideas of the Enlightenment, freedom to do things and freedom from things, freedom to love who you want, freedom from fear and terror and starvation, the idea of equality, the idea of voting, they have power. The idea that you could make your own government gives language to poor people to demand stuff from the rich and the powerful. The Enlightenment is going to fuel unions. It's going to fuel student revolutions in 1848, the rise of unions, civil rights, feminism. It's that language. It is the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And when Jefferson writes that, he means a very particular group of people. Protestant, land-owning men of property, of enough property. People, men like him. He didn't mean Catholics. He certainly didn't mean Jews. Didn't mean the poor. Certainly didn't mean people of African descent. But all those groups are going to say, it says all men. And that applies to me. And then women are going to come along and say, I am a human. That applies to me. So the Enlightenment ideas have power. But also, racism is more powerful than the Enlightenment ideas or Enlightenment economics. The idea, in the end, the Haitian Revolution proved that black people can't be people to white countries. White states were willing to be poorer than to help black people be independent, than to help black people succeed. And there's a book by Heather McGhee, who's a lawyer, called The Sum of Us, in which she talks about this kind of process happening in the 1970s with public pools, especially in the South, that you had public pools that were segregated. Only white people can use them. But the white people of the entire town could use them, or the entire county could use them. Well, come the 70s, after civil rights, after the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, There were a series of court cases saying we African Americans should live in the community. We should get to use the pool. And a series of courts found in their favor. Yes, you should get to use the pool. You're citizens. You pay taxes. It's a public pool. You have a right to it. And what Heather McGhee found was in town after town after town after town, what towns did was close their pools. Rather than let black people and white people swim together in the same place, they closed the pools. Now, rich white people, wealthy white people, could do two things. They could build their own pools in the back. Now, even today, a dug-in pool is $20,000. It's expensive to do. So you could build pools in your backyard, or you can have a private pool that, while the rule can't be no black people are allowed, right? That's discrimination on the basis of race. You're not allowed to do that. You can make the membership fee $1,000 a year, so that only white people, only the wealthiest of white people could join, could afford to join. That was totally legal. And what did that do? It meant that the town or the county was poorer. It lost a pool that everybody could use. And poor white people were out of luck, just so that black people couldn't use it. That's what Haiti was. That white states were unwilling to help a black state succeed. They were willing to have less sugar or to pay for sugar at higher prices. They were willing to do things that economically hurt them just so Haiti wouldn't succeed. So for countries to be independent and to grow, you need infrastructure, stability, education, but also the acceptance of other countries. You need other people to accept you as an equal. And that's true of individuals. It's also true of countries. And so where we started with trauma of Hobbes and the triumph of Locke and the hippie, everybody's equal man of Rousseau. And then we saw those things be put into practice in revolution. The American Revolution, that's conservative, the French Revolution, that is so liberal it gets out of hand and devours itself and then becomes an external war that oppresses other people. And then the Haitian Revolution, which shows that black people can be free. They can make their own country. They can have their own government. But also the conservative backlash to that liberal change. That you may be free, but we don't have to accept you as free. And so that's where we are. And the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution. Thank you very much.